In November 1884, representatives from over a dozen European countries met in Berlin. The reason for the meeting was audacious. They were going to carve up the continent of Africa between them. No one from Africa was in attendance at this conference, and nobody was even invited. And the decisions they made at this conference, and in the decades that followed, can still be felt in the world today. Learn more about the European Scramble for Africa, and how the European powers carved up a continent on this episode of Everything Everywhere Daily.
Want a website with unmatched power, speed, and control? Try Bluehost Cloud, the new web hosting plan from Bluehost, built for WordPress creators by WordPress experts. With 100% uptime, incredible load times, and 24/7 WordPress priority support, your site will be lightning fast with global reach. And with Bluehost Cloud, your sites can handle surges in traffic no matter how big. Plus, you automatically get daily backups and world-class security. Get started now at Bluehost.com.
This episode is sponsored by ButcherBox. Doing a daily podcast means spending a lot of time sitting on my computer researching and recording. To be honest, there have been days that I've been unable to leave the house to go get something to eat, or if I do remember, it's often too late and everything is closed. This is just another reason why I love ButcherBox. They send frozen, high-quality meats and seafoods directly to my door, so I always have something that I can make in my freezer. Whether it's my famous Scotch eggs, a meatloaf, or just cooking up a steak in my cast-iron frying pan, ButcherBox's home delivery makes it easy. With ButcherBox, I don't have to sacrifice quality for convenience. If you leave a busy life and are looking for good food for your family with the ease of home delivery, then you have to try ButcherBox. Sign up for ButcherBox today by going to butcherbox.com/daily and use code DAILY at checkout to get $30 off your first box. Again, that's butcherbox.com/daily and use code DAILY. The Scramble for Africa is a term used by historians to describe the period from 1881 to 1914 and the European quest to grab and colonize as much of the African continent as possible. Before I get into the details of the Scramble for Africa, I need to provide some background on how things got to this point. Europe and Africa were no strangers to each other. When humans first left Africa, Europe was an early stop. As civilization arose, there was a great deal of contact between North Africa and Southern Europe. The Egyptians and the Greeks were very familiar with each other. The Greeks knew of the land south of Egypt, which they called Ethiopia. Homer wrote of the Ethiopians, who he described as coming from a faraway land. Ethiopia was to them everything south of Egypt and the Sahara Desert. And it was known that Ethiopians lived in the Far East near the Red Sea and in the Far West on the Atlantic coast. The Romans had provinces in North Africa, fought at least one battle with the Kingdom of Nubia in Sudan, and may have possibly sent an expedition to West Africa through the Sahara. I bring all of this up to point out a fact that many people overlook. The ties between Africa and Europe were many and were ancient. While there was much about each other that they didn't know, Europeans and Africans knew more about each other than they did about, say, China. They especially knew more than they did about the Americas or Australia, neither of which was even known or hypothesized at the time. In the 15th century, after the Ottoman Empire had obtained a monopoly on trade routes from Asia, Europeans began seeking alternative routes. This necessitated something no European had ever done before: sailing around Africa. The Portuguese originally began sailing around Africa. To support these trade routes, they set up trading posts along the coast. In 1482, a Portuguese trading settlement was established in Elmina, which is what is today Ghana, and this was primarily for trading gold. They also set up trading ports along the coast of Mozambique. Soon after this began, the New World was discovered. There, the Spanish and Portuguese didn't just set up trading ports. They stuck a flag in the ground and claimed enormous swaths of land. Their intent wasn't to trade with locals. Their intent was to control and rule the locals and take whatever resources they could. Over the next several centuries, this became the norm. England and France began taking over large territories in North America. India, much of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Australia, and many islands all became colonies of European powers. In particular, the Atlantic-facing naval powers of England, France, Portugal, and the Netherlands. However, by the 19th century, Africa had largely been ignored in terms of colonization. The big exceptions were South Africa, which had originally been colonized by the Dutch and then taken by the British, and Algeria, which was controlled by the French. As late as 1870, only 10% of Africa was under European control. So why had Africa been ignored for so long? In terms of proximity, Africa could have been the first continent colonized. There are several reasons why. Europeans tended to stay close to the coast because diseases like malaria, yellow fever, and sleeping sickness were widespread in many parts of Africa, and they were deadly to Europeans who lacked immunity. Africa didn't have many navigable rivers, which meant that you couldn't sail up a river to reach the continent's interior. Africa had powerful kingdoms and empires that fought back against European expansion. In addition to providing military resistance, they would have been able to cancel the trade deals that they had previously negotiated, which was the primary European interest prior to the 19th century. Until the 19th century, everything that the Europeans wanted, slaves, gold, and spices, could be obtained from trade with local chiefs and kings without needing a large colonial administration. So, what changed suddenly that caused Africa to become so attractive to Europeans in the late 19th century? The slave trade had been abolished, spices were plentiful and relatively cheap due to other European colonies in Asia. The answer that most historians give is twofold. One is the advent of industrialization. There was a change in the resources that European nations wanted. Minerals and rubber were suddenly in demand, and Africa had them. Industrialization also allowed for easy access to the African interior. Railroads and steamships made it possible to travel long distances and to transport raw materials. Weapons had also improved. Advanced artillery and weapons such as the Gatling gun gave the Europeans a significant advantage over native armies. Perhaps the biggest technical development occurred in 1820, when quinine was isolated from cinchona trees, which was a treatment for malaria, one of the biggest things that prevented Europeans from traveling in Africa. While economics was very important, nationalism and national competition were perhaps even more important. Europeans had been fighting with each other for centuries. After the Napoleonic Wars, European wars actually reduced dramatically. And there was one major exception, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, which resulted in the unification and the creation of a new state called Germany. Countries like Britain, Spain, Portugal, and France were considered powerful countries in no small part due to their colonies, and other countries in Europe wanted in on the action. Each of the major European powers had their own agenda for establishing colonies in Africa. The British Empire was one of the most significant players in the scramble for Africa, seeking to control a continuous line of territory from Cairo to Cape Town, a vision famously associated with Cecil Rhodes. The British acquired vast territories including Egypt in 1882, Sudan, South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, and more. Their control over Egypt was crucial for securing the Suez Canal, a vital route for maintaining their global empire, particularly in Asia and Australia. France sought to build an empire in Africa that would rival its former dominance in the Americas and Asia. France focused on West and Central Africa, acquiring territories such as Senegal, Mali, the Ivory Coast, Guinea, and Chad. In North Africa, they had established control over Algeria in 1830, Tunisia in 1881, and then later Morocco in 1912. The French vision was to create an empire stretching across the Sahara from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. Germany was a latecomer to the colonial game due to its late unification, but pursued colonies under Chancellor Otto von Bismarck's leadership. Germany established control over territories in Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, Namibia, Togo, and Cameroon. Portugal, one of the earliest powers to explore Africa, maintained and expanded its holdings during the scramble. The Portuguese controlled Angola and Mozambique, territories that they had claimed centuries earlier. However, Portugal's ambitions to connect these colonies by expanding inland were thwarted by the British, especially in the famous 1890 British ultimatum, which prevented Portugal from establishing a transcontinental empire. Italy, another latecomer to the colonial race, focused its efforts on North and East Africa. Italy acquired Eritrea and parts of Somalia and attempted to conquer Ethiopia, leading to the First Italo-Ethiopian War. Italy eventually established control over Libya in 1912. Spain, with a declining empire, played a relatively minor role in the scramble. They controlled small territories in North Africa, such as Spanish Morocco and Spanish Sahara, as well as Equatorial Guinea and parts of Western Sahara. Spain's colonial ambitions were limited compared to those of other European powers. King Leopold II of Belgium was one of the most notorious figures in the scramble for Africa. He personally controlled the Congo Free State, today the Democratic Republic of Congo, which was not initially a Belgian colony, but rather a private venture by the king. Under Leopold's rule, the Congo was exploited ruthlessly, leading to widespread atrocities and the deaths of millions of Congolese. The international outcry eventually led to the Belgian government taking control of the Congo in 1908. With all of the European claims to Africa, all of which took place in a relatively short period of time, the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck called for a conference in November 1884 for all the great powers who were interested in Africa. The goal of the conference was to regulate European colonization and trade in Africa and prevent conflict among European powers. In addition to the countries I've just listed, also in attendance were the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Russia, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and the United States. Belgium was not represented, but King Leopold was in the form of the International Association of the Congo, an organization that he controlled. But perhaps most importantly, no one from Africa was invited, was consulted, or was in attendance. The conference spent over 3 months arguing, negotiating, and drawing lines on a map to divide up the African continent. They ended up drawing borders between their colonies, which were often made without any respect for the cultural, linguistic, or even geographic realities on the ground. They were mostly just straight lines made by people who had no clue what they were drawing the lines through. One of the principles that the conference established was known as effective occupation. That meant that European powers had to demonstrate actual control over a territory to claim it as a colony. And this is different from what happened in the New World centuries earlier, where countries like Spain and Portugal just claimed land that they never even saw. The only countries that were spared in the scramble for Africa were Ethiopia and Liberia. Ethiopia was spared because it defeated Italy at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, and Liberia was spared because of its historical relationship with the United States. The Berlin Conference of 1884 wasn't the end of the partitioning of Africa, but it did carve up most of the continent. There were some land swaps between countries after the conference, and the First World War saw Germany lose all of its African colonies to the British. When German East Africa was captured, today Tanzania, it gave the British a single contiguous tract of land that extended all the way from Cairo to Cape Town, what they originally wanted. There are many stories that are lumped into this period in African history, which I plan on covering in future episodes. The barbarism in the Belgian Congo was one of the most horrific episodes in all of human history. The genocide of the Herero and Nama people in Namibia in 1904 is considered to be the first genocide of the 20th century and laid the foundation for the Holocaust. The Anglo-Zulu War and the Battle of Isandlwana, where an army of 20,000 Zulu warriors with spears managed to defeat a technically superior British force. The legacy of the decisions made in Berlin almost 150 years ago is still with us today. The borders of the European colonies became the borders of the newly independent nations during the decolonization movement after the Second World War. Almost every border in Africa today was created by Europeans. The only exceptions are the borders between Sudan and South Sudan and the border of Eritrea, both of which were determined via bloody conflicts. If you look at an ethnic or linguistic map of Africa, you'll notice that it looks nothing like the map of Africa that you're familiar with. When I was in West Africa, I'd meet people and they would identify themselves by both their tribal identity and nationality. For example, they would say that they are Mandinka from Mali or Mandinka from Senegal. Many of the problems that African countries have faced since independence can be directly attributed to the borders drawn back in 1884. Countries that were divided without respect to ethnic groups often saw one group take power at the expense of another group. Many of the civil wars that have ravaged the African continent have been ethnic-based wars, which can be traced back to the ill-created borders. Since decolonization, despite the fact that the borders made no sense, there has been resistance to changing the borders of countries in Africa. The fear is that once the process is legitimized, it will continue at a great cost of human life. And that is why countries like Somaliland are de facto independent in almost every way, yet they don't get the recognition from other countries. The Scramble for Africa and the 1884 Berlin Conference have had a legacy that has lasted long beyond the period of colonization. So much of the current geopolitical state of Africa today is the direct result of decisions made almost 150 years ago, without any input from the very people who were to be most affected. The executive producer of Everything Everywhere Daily is Charles Daniel. The associate producers are Benji Long and Cameron Kieffer. I want to give a big shout out to everyone who supports the show over on Patreon, including the show's producers. Your support helps me put out a show every single day. And also, Patreon is currently the only place where Everything Everywhere Daily merchandise is available to the top tier of supporters. If you'd like to talk to other listeners of the show and members of the Completionist Club, you can join the Everything Everywhere Daily Facebook group or Discord server. Links to everything are in the show notes.